the boxing match. Like the fence. Till captured this. Hey, hero, quick.
Ja, ja, men det går bra. Funderade jag på. Så att det är inga feminister. Ingen annan än
Hello.
Så sköter kameran?
Nej. Jag ska bara spela in det dumma ljudet. Har du doktoranden? Släng dig i väggen. Ska du sitta här?
Nej, jag vågar inte. Inte du hittar bara
Nej, men jag tafsar inte, jag lovar. Ska jag tafsa där uppe?
Ja. Bakom. Nej, vi får se om allting är under kontroll. Alla har vatten.
Blommorna har vatten. De har vatten. Kroncertifierat. Nästan. Vi skulle bara få tag på en sån här bubbelmaskin som kan göra bubbligt vatten också. Så kan det bli helt krancertifierat.
I have
It's because you can write things. This is see how we can pass that.
Well, I don't know. You have to check the regulations. But that's
Boo.
Då vill ni ha mig? Jag vill hälsa er alla varmt välkomna till Amir Haj-Bollouris disputationsseminarium där han kommer att försvara sin avhandling Designing for Adaptable Learning. Jag kommer kort beskriva hur själva seminariet går till. Men allra först så vill jag be er försäkra er om att ni har använt av era mobiler. Det vet ni ju. Amir kommer ju som sagt att försvara sin avhandling vid detta seminariet. Och vi har en extern opponent som är huvudgranskaren av innehållet. Sen har vi en betygskommitté vars främsta uppgift är att ta ställning till om Amirs avhandling kan godkännas som en doktorsavhandling inom ämnet informatik med inriktning mot arbetsintegrerat lärande. Och betygsnämnden kommer få tillfälle att ställa frågor till Amir direkt efter när opponenten har avslutat sin granskning. Och efter betygsnämnden så kommer alla de övriga i publiken också att få tillfälle att ställa frågor. Betygsnämnden kommer sedan att dra sig tillbaks och överlägga, diskutera, komma fram till en bedömning. Under tiden så väntar ni publiken i entré AEL. Och sedan kommer betygskommittén att komma dit och meddela resultatet, betyget. Först så har vi haft 3 handledare som sitter här och det är professor Lars Svensson, professor Per Flensburg och doktor Thomas Widman. Eftersom den huvudsakliga kommunikationen under själva granskningen av avhandlingen kommer att ske på engelska så byter jag nu språk helt enkelt. Och jag kommer först att välkomna vår opponent. So I welcome you very much, Professor Maung Saim from Institute of Information Systems, Haj-Bolouri University in Norway. And then we have the examining committee. And first we have Professor Virpi Tunanen from Department of Information and Service Economy, Aalto University in Finland. We also welcome Professor Tero Päivärinta from the Department of Computer Science and Electrical and Space at Engineering at Umeå University and Technology. And finally, we have Professor Per Åger Falk, Department of Informatics and Media in Uppsala University. And now I think that the opponent will start the review seminar with making a summary of the thesis. and then the dialogue will begin. So please let the review seminar begin.
I think I've lost it. It just went off. You know, when I was in university, we had a rule. If the professor doesn't arrive within 3 minutes, there's 5 minutes, there's no class. So if you don't get it within 5 minutes, you pass.
That sounds good.
There we go. Okay, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Well, first of all, thank you for the introduction, because the last time I did this in Oslo, the introduction was, here's the PhD, and here's Professor Singh who opposed the dissertation. I have never figured out the term, why I'm an opponent, because I'm not really opposing you. The only one who can oppose you is yourself. And as you know, this is, if you go to the design board, and you know that's that, there's nothing I can do. I can help you in opposing yourself, and that's what I'm going to do. Yeah. But first, let me see if I understand what you did. So this is the tale. To me, every thesis, every project, every paper is a story. And you tell the story in one way. And this is how I read the story. So, as a tale, every tale has a beginning. And to me, the beginning was this. You know, it's a globalized world. People are moving everywhere. Immigrants move to another country, for example, to Sweden. I myself is an immigrant in many ways. I've moved to many, many different countries, and I finally found my way to Norway. So what happens? Is it a problem? Hopefully not. But this is an issue, though. This is a challenge. That you've got immigrants, they're newcomers, and they need to be integrated in the host society. Now, of course, I read somewhere that the integration is a two-way process. But whatever is the case, it doesn't matter. It's either, you know, people coming in, but you need to live in that particular society, and there's a lot of give and take that actually happens. And we know that it's a big issue. It's an issue when you read it in the papers all the time. And there are certain aspects of this that I'd like to go deeper into that. And then, so what is the challenge? Well, how to do the integration? That's the, you know, the drive behind this. It's well and good to say that it's going to be, but how do we do it? And at least in this particular case, and in many countries, the public authorities, they take on this challenge. It's not simply them, but the onus, the responsibility is mostly on the public authorities to do this. So they do it, and in Sweden, it's done by what we call integration workers. There's people who work in that particular field, and they do all sorts of activities related to do that. So, well, I think we understand the setting, the scenario, but what is the problem in here? Okay, so in Sweden, the newcomers take 60 hours of civic orientation classes. Now, based on what I read, what I checked, it started as a language course. People have to learn the language. I myself, when I went moved to Norway, I had to take Norwegian courses, and that's the government provides free classes. I understand that they don't. To what extent this is successful, you can judge. You can actually quiz me afterwards and talk in Norwegian and see if I can. But my cousin, who came as a student, also had to take these classes. And after finishing the course, she got a certificate saying that we are now Norwegian speaking person. But she only remembers one sentence in Norwegian, which is "Hvor kommer du fra?" Which is quite interesting. Because I asked, why? He said, well, that's the question everybody asks. The teacher would ask, "Hvor kommer du fra?" Vietnam, from there. That's all she remembered, but she has a certificate, which shows. And because she's applying for jobs, she feels justified in putting on her CV that I speak Norwegian. And I said, well, let's hope that the Norwegian doesn't interview you. The classes are run by different municipalities in Sweden. Now, the thing is, the newcomers come from many backgrounds. So I was telling you about my cousin. But when I took these classes, I also there were people from different countries that were sitting around. And I happened to sit next to an American. Actually, and then on the other side, there was another American. And then we also had Pakistanis. There were two Pakistani sisters around there. And then there was an Icelander, which is very interesting because the Icelander said he knew a little bit about this Norwegian. But what appealed him to a lot of people was he was also a biker. And he had all this dark, long hair, and he would do it. So the point is that they come from many backgrounds. And so they have many different world views, to use your term. Now, to make this challenge even more is that the integration workers also, they're from many backgrounds. And if I read between the lines from the thesis, there were integration workers who themselves are immigrants working around. So, now, in itself, the heterogeneities per se may not be a problem. You say, well, doesn't that enrich the experience and so on? But trying to provide a course of civic orientation with all this background, not only from the immigrants, but also the integration workers, that can be a challenge. And why would it be? What if you say, okay, we run this, and they're all run in the local context? It won't be a very big problem. However, how do we standardize the program so that everybody gets that experience and everybody gets integrated in a correct manner? Because, if you say, well, we have this problem in this particular case, you say, well, that's because of your program, not because of this program. But if you standardize one, you can all blame the standardized program. So, can we use digital technology? So there's a whole series of events that happened which led to this notion of using digital technology. And if I understand it correctly, there's a general trend towards this digitization from the Swedish government. And that also influenced that, well, we need to use this particular aspect in here. So, here it is. So Amir started asking questions. This thesis. He asked many questions, by the way, so how do design integration work?
How to design for integration work. Sorry, I just had to say that because it's quite a big distinction.
Okay, it is. That's correct. How to design for. Well, maybe I should take off certain part of my question. How to design for? I think that's hold on to that thought, because I would like to go into this how to design for that. Right, so what makes designing integration work significant? Why do integration work? The three main questions that he has.
Sorry, Professor, but I must be quite rude here. It's actually, the second one is what makes designing for integration work significant.
Of course.
And the third one is why to design for integration work. But perhaps I sent you the wrong copy, I don't know. I hope
We'll
not.
find out right now.
Yeah.
But why not we discuss the wrong copy then? Let's see. No, you're right. I'm wrong. As soon as you add 4, everything changes. You do have how to design for integration work, how to, that's correct. And what makes designing for integration work, yeah. And why do design for integration work? Well, maybe we can come back to these questions. Anyhow.
Yeah.
All right, so he pondered, he thought, he read, he rethought, he reread. Did a great deal of thinking and reading. And then he realized this. A system for integration work should allow workers to learn in an adaptable way. And learning should be work-related, work-integrated learning. I don't know, we still, maybe we should just dialogue while I'm doing that. But you can, you're actually, so here are your labors. You found a perfect method for research. It's called ADR. It is perfect, and then he actually justified it, why it is. There are certain aspects of ADR which is there. But it pleased me a lot that this was the right method for this. Conducted 3 cycles of ADR. Much thought, theories, and concepts and philosophies went into each cycle. So the point about ADR is that you have, it's based on real problem. It's not a toy problem. It's practice-oriented research. And that's the reason why, because this is a practical problem. You do it. So you create knowledge through solving a practical problem. And you actually end up designing what we call an artifact as a result of this design research. So all design research, their aim is to develop an artifact. Now what an artifact is, it doesn't necessarily have to be a system, although that is one type of it. It could be a framework, it could be a theory, it could be a method, and all of that could be the outputs of design research, of this form of research. And that is the knowledge that is abstracted out of actually working on it. Now, in designing these artifacts in ADR, you don't just do it out of thin air. You say, I do it because I think this is interesting. In fact, one of the co-authors of this paper, which Amir cites, which actually launched ADR, Sandeep Purao, he said a long time ago, the design is not a theoretical tinkering, which means you just take something and say, well, I tried this, I tried that. And now, if you do some theoretical tinkering, does it actually produce some useful artifact? Of course it does. One of the best examples is Thomas Edison. He used to do a lot of tinkering. We don't really know what went through his mind, but there are examples of where he did not have a theoretical insight. And so he ended up coming up with certain things which people started calling the Edison effect. So anytime you hear this word effect, it means you don't know what the explanation is, just call it an effect. So a lot of theories and concepts went in, but also, in Amir's case, philosophies went into each cycle. And some were used in the design of the effect, and some were not. That's my reading. So each cycle produced knowledge. It did. Some of which were used in the next cycle. So you do one cycle, a certain thing you learned, you went into the next cycle. Some were left for future work. Well, okay, maybe this is something we learned, we could actually apply it in here. But some made Amir a philosopher. And that is very clear in this particular, in my reading of this. So this is his ADR cycles. So from left to right. This is the first one is the first cycle. And in the first cycle, the problem understanding, which is the problem was understood as civic orientation and so on. Now, Amir uses a term which I found very appealing and also curious, problematize. It's not conceptualize. I problematize something as this, that, and the other, and maybe it's the effect of Heidegger. We sort of problematize it mostly. And did produce an alpha prototype, and then he has the design implications. He does not talk about design principles, which is something that we, or explicitly he doesn't talk about design principles at that point, but he had a whole list of design guidelines, which is what it should actually produce. So I'm actually, if I'm working with ADR and I'm producing an artifact which is designed to actually solve a specific problem, and even if you solve it, what is it that I have abstracted out of it so that others can actually use it? This is what we call the generalized outcome, which was his design implications. And then he did some early theorizing. And now, the thing that actually bothered him at that time was this notion of presence. So you see, if you are, right now, we are in one room. So we are present. But if we were doing it through electronically, let's say Skype or something like that, so I'm not present, Amir is not present, you may not be present. So how does it actually affect the interaction that we have? And Amir's argument is that yes, it does. And we know that. I was telling Theo here about a course that I teach on something called Adobe Connect, and which is, and there are students everywhere. And I find myself sitting in front of a computer screen for 2 hours and looking like, I sometimes feel I look like an idiot. Here I am just talking into the screen, and then I was with a colleague who was laughing while I was doing this. So anyway, so what does that actually mean to be present in this? So there are many aspects, there are many theories and concepts that people could use to think about his presence. But not for Amir. He went into Heidegger and he tried to conceptualize, or maybe I should say problematize, presence in terms of design. Now, I like this term design, although every time I read it I get very confused. One reason, thank you for actually pronouncing my name as Sign. So I am the Sign, so the actual Burmese pronunciation, I will not correct anybody, as long as Heidegger is around. So he came up with this notion called digital design, using Heidegger's phenomenology. Right, then he moved on to the next cycle, which is workplace learning heterogeneity. So once you think about the components of this system that you have to build, what should it be in this particular case? And one is that it should be workplace related, because it has to be learning that they learn while they're actually doing the work. So, you might have noticed, for example, trainees in like restaurants or fast food place or cashiers, and they say, well, this is workplace learning. Of course, they mess things up badly. I can tell you a story about that, but this is not the time, about my interaction with the workplace training. And of course, there's heterogeneity. So based on this, he reframed the problem as it's not e-learning per se and so on, but it has to be the workplace learning. And so far it is, that's where it stands. So he produced a better prototype. I think, if I remember right, this is where the collabogenous, whatever, this tongue-twisting system came into being. That is the better prototype. And then out of that, something else he actually theorized in learning, which is a variation, if you will, of area called Padre. So I suppose if somebody actually starts using it and it comes, they might come and say, oh, Madre Mia, this is a great method. And that's adaptable e-learning, which is where this is what came out of it. So if I read it right, these are things that actually went into it, and then this is what that came out, and so these should go here to that solution. So you got that, what's adaptable learning, then these are the actual physical prototypes, if you will, that were implemented. This training material, the implementation theorizing. And then here's the other philosophical outcome, if you will. It's called kernel philosophy, which I find very interesting, although it's still a bit hard. So, in the end, his products are this thesis. It's called Designing for Adaptable Learning. Here, you all have it in your hand, so we know. It's present. It's present at hand. No,
That's highly good.
it's already at hand. The way I'm looking at it is as a present at hand, but we'll come to that. Many papers, he wrote tons and tons of papers. 4 are parts of this thesis. It was interesting to me to look at, why these 4 papers are, but I'll leave it to the discussion part. And so let's come back to this answers. Okay, so the questions are all wrong because there should be how to design for integration work. But this is how he answered anyhow into this, because I know his answers. It's, there's an Urdu poet. First I have to say it in Urdu, and then I can translate. In Urdu it is like, "Sawali sab galat the, to jawab kya dete?" Which means the questions are all wrong, so how can I answer those, So it seems to have come into a situation of this sort. But I think even if I put how to design for, the answers are what he has. So there's IS design theory for adaptable system. This is how you design for integration work. Now something thought came to mind. Can we also have a design theory for to design integration work, not for integration? So it's something to just set aside. It's not something to discuss. There's a design research method incorporating work integrated learning. It's called Padre. What makes designing for integration work significant? The way I read it, he's citing Habermas or maybe Heidegger to answer this question. But we can actually, as I said, why do integration work? Why design for integration work? But to me, this is an interesting question. Why do integration work? So even if it is not an accurate summation of what you did, I would, like to talk to you about this. So, what fruits you got? Which is a different way of putting what are the contributions to that. Well, first we got the artifact, which is a digital platform for civic orientation. It's interesting the way this is phrased. That I actually put, it's not simply a system in that sense, it's actually a platform. So now one can discuss what is a platform, and this you may find sort of very academic, but this whole notion of a platform, we had a huge discussion about this one time. And many people started bringing in metaphors to do that. It's a platform, it's like the whole platform, you put things in there. And then suddenly, so what about a platform as a diving platform? You have a 10-meter platform diving, 3-meter diving platform, and everybody laughed. But then afterwards the game said, well, yeah, it's sort of a springboard to actually do something. So, anyhow, that is the... and the number of what I call design-related things, for want of a better word, first is the IS design theory for adaptable system. There's a design research method incorporating what integrated learning. And then we have a meta-design of an open learning platform for what it will be. Then they have got these philosophical ideas. There's a notion of kernel philosophy, which, if I understand correctly, is that we have this notion of kernel theories. And in a very early paper on design-oriented research, we use this term kernel theories. Now, there are two aspects of kernel theories. One is that, okay, remember that when you do design research, it's not a theoretical tinkering. So you bring in theoretical concepts into it. So this is the theory that gets ingrained. So these could be kernel theories. That's what goes in. But some theories come out after that. And this is not maybe not be a full-fledged theory, but these are little kernels. Kernels being, small. Although my father was in the army and he had got a completely different idea when I said kernel. Actually, he was one. And then digital design. That's a concept, and that's a piece of kernel philosophy, if you will. And I intend to spend a lot of time talking about the digital design in here. Right, so what is his reward? The right to be grilled by me and by these three distinguished scholars. The outcome, we will know at 5 o'clock. Or, that is my summation. And actually,
do you use any particular sauce when you
well, this is summer. So, okay. People's thought turn to grilling is what it is. So, by the way, I hope you read between the lines what I said. This is grilling of Amir Haj-Bolouri's thesis. I'm not grilling him. I'm grilling his thesis, although he's present. So he might say that it is, candidate in being. So here we go. So do you recognize this?
Yes, I do recognize that, but I cannot place it in a suitable. No, I don't know who it is.
Heidegger.
Is it?
Yes.
Okay, sorry.
Every man is born. No, it's okay. I came across this not through my readings about his philosophies. It's from reading actually a spy novel by John Le Carre, and he's come up with a new book, and then he starts with this. So first of all, I thought, I like reading Le Carre, but now I like him even more. It's somebody with a philosophical aspect. But a paraphrase is that every thesis work is born out of collaboration with many men. You defend as a single man, okay? So this is what your point is. All right. So this is my agenda, and the first question is, so would you retell the story? Did I actually?
No, I think you did it perfectly fine, actually.
Other than missing out the fours.
Yeah. Beside the questions, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
But
So
those are not so important, obviously.
yes.
Yeah.
So what we can actually do is we can actually try to think about this presentation by just think about designing for and by putting this for. I think it's a very important word for, because for years I've been, I do not philosophize as much as you do, but what I actually do is whenever a new term comes up, as a designer, to me it's always interesting, how does it inform design? I mean, if you say, well, it informs understanding, fine. But I can just stop at understanding. Because, once you become this design, you become a design being. Design, then you start thinking about it. You project in the future. So it's a lot of it. This is what I'm actually doing. So one of the things that I had always, and I gave a few talks about this, was this notion of social materiality. How does it actually help? Can social materiality inform design? I came to the conclusion, and I will be wrong in that you cannot design social materiality. is because it's so situated, it's so contextual that I can actually do that for myself, you know. But recently, I accepted a paper where they said you design for the emergence of social materiality. Made a lot of sense to me. So that's why I think that this notion of for is very important, because why is for important?
You were going to say that, but I can give you my version.
I know what I think. I want to know what you think.
Oh, I think it's from its simplistic meaning. When we design, we don't design for. Oh, we design for something, obviously. Some people argue that you want to design for solving problems. Some people say that you want to design in order to identify problems. Then it becomes the for becomes oriented towards not only designing a solution, but also discovering new problems through the design process. So the for is more or less a term that orients the design activity towards something.
Well, does it say anything about the design process itself?
Well, the word that comes after for elucidates something about the design process. So, for instance, designing for integration work, designing for something else gives you a hint about the design process, but it doesn't give you a justified picture about the whole package.
Let's come back to this in my last point.
Yeah.
It depends on whether we have time or not, which you did not actually go into. But that was my introduction
Yes.
to the question concerning technology, some technology, and then we can come back and actually. So this is the agenda that I have right now.
Yeah.
So I'd like to go about problem formulation, areas that inform your thesis work, your area cycles, and so on. Then we'll talk about kernel theories. Then we have these questions. We did the same thing about philosophies. We'll talk a little bit about Habermas, but the Habermas expert is sitting here. So it will be a questioning act on his part. And then we'll talk about Heidegger, and this is how it will be. Is it okay with you?
Yeah, of course. I hope so.
So now we have gone through this, and I'll come back to this cycle. But first of all, you said you use ADR, right?
Yes.
And this is from your thesis.
Yes.
I feel like I'm a lawyer. Would everybody please turn to page this and let the court record show that he is. Amir, I'm going to ask you a very unfair question.
Yes.
And a tricky question.
Okay.
Based on this. And what is wrong with this figure?
What's wrong with that figure?
Yeah. Or is anything wrong with this figure? Mind you, I've told you it's a trick question and it's an unfair question.
I took this figure from your paper back in 2011. So if it's something wrong with that, I guess it's something wrong with the paper from 2011. But I'm not sure. But then again, I remember Matti once mentioned to me that you had made errata.
Aha! You know, one thing that I actually enjoyed about reading a thesis is this. So I'm reading through it, and I see a point, and I said, oh, he should be talking about work-integrated learning. I turned the next page, there it is. You know, and then that's not the first one. There are many cases where I said, oh yeah, well this is, so for example, you talk about work and adaptable learning as a duality.
Oh yes. Yeah.
So as I read, so what must be duality. I even wrote down the question before I finished. What do you think? Is it duality? I turned the page and there it is. You have that. So you're ahead of me in many of those cases. And in this particular one, he said, let me ask you this question. Why is there no arrow between stage 1 and stage 2? Problem formulation to building intervention.
Well, that's a very good question. I think you got me there, actually. I missed that arrow.
Okay, so now you're right about this. So this question was sent to me by somebody from Hong Kong. Right? So why don't you have an arrow between problem formulation and the building intervention evaluation? Because that follows.
Yeah.
You have this state. And you know what I did? I was an idiot. I started explaining. I said, well, you do, but it goes to reflection. You formulate a problem and you go to reflection, it goes down, then you start building in intervention evaluation, then you go back to problem formulation. It made perfect sense to me. Then I went back to the manuscript and there was no such theorizing out of this. This is what it is. So Irata came out and they put an arrow right there, and I'm sorry, you can't actually see this, but Janice said, we regret that there is an error in figure 1 of the paper, and so on and so forth, and that there should be an arrow in there.
This is the errata, right? Yeah.
So this is the correct one.
Mm-hmm.
So does that change your...
Little bit.
I know my omitting the word for changed a lot of things. You can question whether it is, but does it do it?
Well, yes, it does, but I mean, if we, beside this little problem with how I use the notation of the figure, I mean more, the process, if you look at the cycles, it describes that there is an arrow from stage 1 to stage 2 and that it's iterative.
So could it be that, that to you it was natural, I mean, that the arrow was there, I mean, because that's what you're actually doing. Because that's how you actually describe from, the stage 1 to stage 2. For a lot of people, say, well, that's how it should be. So the arrow is in your mind in a way. Would that be a fair statement?
Well, yeah.
So you were in a sort of a flow.
Mm.
So if you talk about this, so you did not see it as a breakdown in that sense, because to you it actually didn't matter.
Breakdown.
Well, I mean, if you say there's no error, and so well, there's something wrong with it. That person from Hong Kong had a breakdown. I mean, no, I don't know if he had a breakdown, but maybe after using this it had. But in terms of this, if you think of this as an equipment in a way, let's say.
No, for me, it felt quite intuitive to just work according to. I mean, if you read the MISQ paper, I do not so much pay attention towards all the arrows, I must say. I'm not sitting looking at the figure and then, I should basically just remember this. But the story tells much more than the figure. Of course, a picture says more than 1,000 words, but you need 990 words to say something about the picture. So from that sense, it felt quite natural just to work without paying so much attention to work. Is it an arrow there or not?
Well, maybe an arrow says 1,000 words.
Sometimes, yeah.
It always was quite an interesting thing here. So I'll come back to this cycle in a way. Let me also talk about areas that inform your thesis work. I'm talking about this research tradition that went into it. You talk about e-learn. So the question marks I have was, did these areas really consciously inform your work, or you looked at these areas but not really, not entirely, if you will?
Such as e-learning, you mean?
E-learning in practice.
E-learning in practice. Well, my main emphasis when it comes to e-learning was more on e-learning per se, the broader scope of e-learning, and that also includes e-learning in practice, because of course there are some varieties in terms of research about e-learning in universities and e-learning in the industry and different kind of findings and so forth, but from a broader picture, when I use knowledge to inform the design process, I mostly look at the fundamental notions considering a theoretical background of theory such as ones concerning e-learning.
So, I mean, you make a point that when it comes to philosophy, and we look at this, philosophy has been used fairly, I wouldn't say extensively, but not inextensively. So now we're talking about the philosopher's words, right? Not extensive is not inextensive, and so on and so forth. To understand, to explain, but not so much as to actually inform design, which is what you attempted to do in it. So, if you look at practice, how it has been actually done in many ways, it may sound like, there's not much theoretical of, God forbid, philosophical ingraining of those. But there are systems that are out there. Have you heard of a fellow called Badrul Khan?
No, I haven't.
Let me make a pitch for it. He's a good friend of mine. And he has this model called, I don't know, so the sides increase. So it started with a pentagon and now it's a hexagon. And when you actually look at it from an academic perspective, there's hardly anything. Basically, he's saying if you want to design an e-learning system, it should have a technical dimension, it should have an organizational dimension, all the stuff that we actually know. Except he's put it in a very nice, in his, what is that term? Patented it. And he's very obsessed with that because if you go to his house, he's got hexagon-shaped tables and he's got hexagon-shaped all of that, so. But he has written tons of books about that, and he goes around actually giving lectures on this. And one of the reasons why it is very popular with practitioners is that it's very simple to understand. So if you say, well, okay, so he went to, I think, Qatar, and said, okay, we're going to design this. It's not in a university setting, but, I don't quite remember what it is. And he said, oh, we can follow this, because there are all these guidelines. So technical dimensions, I need to look at this, that, and the other. And I was discussing his work with another professor from me. He said, well, yeah, he's done great, but what have we actually learned? So, well, here's actually effective practice. How would you place that kind of work? And should that inform your kind of work?
That's a very difficult question to address because if I understood you correctly, that story, the whole thing with that story was that you can come up with different kind of artifacts without even having some kind of practical value attached to that in the end.
No, I didn't say that yet, but I might.
Yeah.
In half an hour or so. but I'm saying the opposite. So yeah, what's an artifact which has been used and around. And we as academics, are we missing something by ignoring those?
Yes, we are. In some cases we are. That's why I push forward philosophy so much as I do. And I mean, I can give you a couple of examples, if you don't mind. So in my own case, as I said, by the way, before, design was not only to hear the problem, solve the solution by designing an artifact that solves this solution, but more a process that identifies a problem as something emerging. So that's why I like the ADR framework. You go from one cycle to another cycle, and you expand this problem solution awareness. Their problem is emerging all the time. And through design, you discover these problems. And some problems are, of course, easily to address by designing practical solutions that satisfies the stakeholders and users. But when you deal with notions such as presence or heterogeneity and try to understand the nature of these things, then philosophy becomes relevant. Because philosophers are interested in understanding. They're not always solving problems. they understand problems and they try to analyze that into an absurdum. And that was what I basically did through these 3 cycles. So philosophy, without using philosophy here, I would say I would not be able to come up with these findings which I have come up with in this thesis, because philosophy has a so important role in terms of not only informing the design. By the way, what do we mean by design? That's another thing we can discuss, but from this most simplistic perspective, the process where we create things. We are creative as human beings. But more to take several steps back and reflect upon why we are designing these. Why should we do it at all? And why is heterogeneity important for, in this case, designing for integration work? And how does that affect my view about this concept which I came up with, adaptable learning? So how are these fitting together? And I need to establish a critical mindset in order to understand the meaning of this. So, yes, I'm not sure if I addressed your question properly, but this was my answer towards your question. So I believe that we need these kind of things as academics, because we are interested in designing the artifacts to solve problems and distill knowledge from that and put back into academia. But we're also interested in using academic knowledge to understand how to design things to solve problems.
What's the yeah. Heterogeneity and what was the other thing you just mentioned?
Presence, worldviews.
No, you just said heterogeneity. Was it adaptable learning? In this case, so, you know, I buy it. I think anybody looking at this particular context will say yes, of course, because there are all these various types of. But when you talk about conceptualizing heterogeneity, in this particular case, you've got different backgrounds, different worldviews. Although one might question, and I might, that the heterogeneity you actually brought into it was more about backgrounds, and I think when we talk about worldviews, it was more about the work view, if I may use that term. You know, what is it, this integration work, what I do, and so on and so forth. To me, a worldview, now, so you mentioned about Wittgenstein, but let's not get more deeper into that. But a worldview, philosophically speaking, it's much broader about this, isn't it? So we come back to this notion about the problem formulation. Well, let me tell a very short story. You have to bear with me. I tell a lot of stories, you know, and then hopefully these make sense. To be clever, when people have to put in, you know, interesting presentations and so on, I thought that so I thought I'll go to YouTube and I'll try to find clips of moving to Sweden. By the way, there was a TV series on NBC. I think he's coming to Sweden, moving to Sweden, something else. This is an American guy. He's a agent. So he has a Swedish girlfriend, which is, you know, half of the reason why people actually move in, I found, at least in academia, there's a personal relationship involved in that. So they moved in, and then, you know, the stuff that he has to go through, etc., etc. And one of the clips that I was telling Per about that was because he's an agent, he said, well, you have to do something. So he started visiting all these Swedish icons. So, you know, so you went to Benny of ABBA. And he said, well, you know, I can. So what for? And they said, well, you can make more money. He said, I don't need any more money. So you talk about these various types of, so to me the word, but then, that was, I couldn't find it. And all the other clips that I found were all these people who are saying immigrants are no good, they do this, they do that, and so on and so on. So I said, well, maybe those will not be good clips to actually bring in today. We'll leave it for another day. But the point is, when you talk about immigration, and this has been a theme in many parts of the world, and you know, of the country that I'm a citizen, which is the US, and it's a huge issue in it. Do you think that when we talk about integration work and worldview, how they view immigration as a phenomenon, if you will, Is that a factor in this?
How to view immigration as a
Yeah.
factor? As a factor of
In this particular work?
this particular work.
Because you're designing for integration work.
Yes.
And why is it significant, et cetera, why
Yeah.
you design? But should that be a part, that input that should go into your work?
I think it's an inevitable thing to not address when you, as I do, preach about designing for integration work. But then again, I wouldn't say that it is based on my conception only about integration as a phenomenon, because that would be quite foolish to. I mean, I try to understand this from a broader perspective, and there it is inevitable to not touch upon different worldviews, because basically everyone has.
Not to.
It is inevitable to not go into different worldviews. It is a fact that you need to go into different worldviews. Sorry for the double negation there. Yeah, so.
No, I bring it up because you're talking about your view about design,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And it's not just designing something like this. So what sort of, say for example, if you invoke Heidegger, right? So it's all this notion of referential totality, and then, if you're design, then of course the past is part of this and you're living the present, but it's also projecting the future.
Mm.
So this is a sort of a view of a design that I actually think, So in that case, I'll tell you again another thing. When people become U.S. citizens, you have to go through interviews, right? And apparently it didn't used to be the case in Norway. I don't know if it's the case in. How does people become a citizen in Sweden? You just show up and you say, well, I want to be after a certain number of years. I don't know. But in the US, you have to go through this test, fingerprinting, all sorts of stuff, and they give you 100 questions about civic sense, history.
Yeah.
Now, if the case handler likes you, you mean, the applicant, then they're asked questions like, who was the first president of US? Who is the current governor of this, and so on. And you answer 6 out of 10 correctly, so you have passed. If that person doesn't like you, then the question will be, what were the socio-political causes of the Civil War? Good. Do you know? No, you can't say that. They'll ask all sorts of these sorts of questions. What do you think about integration, so on and so forth, and so you fail. So the point is that, why would anyone, it's the same person, they're supposed to be these, immigration workers, I don't know what you call them, asked differently. Is it, one might say it's a prejudice, but there also could be something like they have this view, right, we need immigrants, but not like Donald Trump once said, we should get more immigrants from Norway. He didn't mention Sweden, by the way, he said we should get more people from Norway. That's because the Norwegian Prime Minister was visiting him. So you have this view, and you can see, racial undertones or ethnic undertones, etc. But these are the people who are actually working.
Yeah.
And maybe, whether you call them authentic design or inauthentic design, but they have a worldview.
Yeah.
So should that have, I don't know, I was just wondering what your thoughts are. You didn't look at it, so it's fine. It's not an essential part. I mean, your contribution to knowledge does not hang on that.
Yes. But I mean, if I may just comment that, is okay?
Yeah.
So in the context of
I have to say if it is okay, because that's what we are doing.
Okay. So in the context of civic orientation, the integration workers, as I mentioned, they were heterogeneous. Some of them were, the core essence of providing civic orientation is that you have to have the ability to communicate with the newcomers through their own language. And that implies that you basically have a background that is relying on understanding about culture, norms, values from those countries that the newcomers derive from. What happens here is that these people who are in constant dialogue with the newcomers are not sitting and asking them lots of questions in order for them to pass anything, because civic orientation don't have any moments of evaluation. You just have to be present 60 hours, and then and then you pass. But what happens there is that, what I say in my thesis is that through all these social interactions, worldview is something that is inevitable to not discuss about from an academic point of view at least, because all these tutors and these newcomers are constantly exchanging. I mean, the tutor has a responsibility to inform what the Swedish society is about, but it isn't so much about you have to learn this. It's more like you get oriented towards all these different elements of Swedish society. And putting some value into that in comparison to the process you were talking about, I would say that that is based upon a worldview of society. The society thinks that this is more feasible in order to integrate newcomers into the society. So we don't have this formalized process of we should do this and that, who was the first king of Sweden and so forth. But you get more acquainted with all these elements of society. Good or bad, well, that's another question.
By the way, as a segue, you wrote many papers together, and you chose 4.
Yeah.
I understand that you had more, and it has been trimmed to, based on feedback you got from Per.
Yeah.
So maybe the question is directed towards Per. No. Well, what intrigued me was, look, I didn't read all the papers. No, I should tell you, but I did read some of the papers that were out. I read your 4 papers, obviously, but some that are not in that list. And there's one paper that probably you guessed, because it was easy to get an advance copy. I just had to walk down the corridor, and I asked Devinder, and he said, here's this copy.
Oh, yeah.
And this is about social values.
Yes. Yes, he's smiling over here because
yes.
he was trying to...
So let me ask you this question. To use your term, if I may. Why did you include that in this?
Why I didn't include it? You know the answer. It's because of the system which we are bound to, academia. It wasn't published in anywhere.
Would you select a paper or something?
Oh no, the Habermas paper was a selected paper.
Oh, okay.
But not that one.
No, do you think that it was very relevant?
Yes, definitely.
I think it was. It would have. I think it was very relevant. I think it goes to the heart of some of this discussion that we're actually having.
Yes.
You mentioned very briefly in one somewhere that you mentioned it that this is what it is, and I think you also had some extracts of it. Maybe if you're going to do it again, perhaps you could have like a chapter on it or something. So a way of sneaking in these unpublished papers, I always tell my students, is to make it part of your summary, the kappa, and then you can actually do it in that way. Okay. And then you have training. This is part of it. Workplace trainings, and in fact one of the interventions was training. Right? If I'm not, or am I missing? No. Are you still dying as a single man, Amir?
I am single, yes.
Getting a Ph.D. does not help you in that regard.
But perhaps I'm dying then.
The opposite. Here we go. In your 3rd cycle, you said you talk about training material, implementation, etc. Now, there is a pretty vast literature on training in IS. Now I should know this because I've written a whole bunch of paper on it, and that was what my thesis was on. And then when I said a few minutes ago that there are some areas where I read your thesis, and then I said, oh, this was it, and then there it was already in the next page. So you're ahead of me. Here, I'm reading certain parts. I said, oh, geez, this is what and it's not there. Now, you can take it as an egoistic thing. How come he never read about my papers? So on. Wonder about that. But whether it's relevant or not. So, training. Let's talk a little bit about training, because this was my first love. You had this, you said workplace training, no, work setting training? There's
Oh,
one.
workplace training, yes.
How did you do it? I mean, what is the, how was it implemented? Or to use David Letterman, how did it manifest itself?
I like that we are having this philosophical chat, by the way, using philosophical terms. Well, the whole, that whole event was organized very formally, I would say. And it was formalized and organized and conducted through 10 to 12 sessions or something like that. And each session was moderated by myself, that guy over there, and
Which guy?
the one with the sunglasses. He's one of the co-authors.
Where was this?
This was at the integration center in Gothenburg.
So they
it
have
was
like
at a work
room
setting.
and they have a,
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, we had rooms, different rooms, obviously, and we had used technology, and we were much fond about having preserving this dialogic process of learning. So it wasn't so much about instructional learning in some senses. It was more about providing some conceptual notions and then grounded empirically, demonstrated, and work together in their setting. So that's one of the major work integrated learning contributions in this thesis, at least. So it was highly formalized, I would say.
okay. You know, one of my colleagues, a good friend of mine, he actually did a study on why people go to training.
Why?
Why would you say, all right, we're going to have this training and people volunteer. And why do they do it? What is the motivation for training? Can you guess what his top answer was?
The fear of losing one's job, perhaps? I don't know.
Well, that was one of them, but it was not the top one.
Okay.
It might surprise you. The top one is get away from office.
Mm-hmm.
The training is somewhere in there near this, and oh, we have a nice time, the social aspect. And they didn't really care about what this training was. And so the question was, when my friend went to give this feedback to the manager, he said, "No, we know that. So what you're wasting money?" He said, "No, but it keeps their motivation up." So, okay, you do mention this word affordance here somewhere, which has to come in here. But let's not add more to the. It's already we have a whole baggage in here. Although there are a few philosophical and theoretical concepts that I will bring up later on. And so why is that? They said, well, it keeps people happy. They're happy. They come back. They're pleased. They work like whatever for. So one might say it's a very instrumental way of doing it. Some people said expert. Whatever is the case. So that was one of the main. But the actual work, integrated learning, and many years ago, one of my we call him brothers because he was doing a Ph.D. Along with me in Indiana, a fellow called Lauren Altman. He came up with this concept called application-oriented training or application-based training, whatever it was. But I'll tell you how he used to do that. So when you have a particular training, he would not. It's always software training, right? Some system. So he would say that, okay, we're going to have a training on Word. Those days, Word was, or Word Perfect, I can't even remember, it's like several generations ago of this. But he would say something like this, what do you do? We used to have a sort of a diagnostic phase. He said, I do this, I send out letters. So I make this budget, and somebody will say, I write memos. I said, fine, just bring your last assignment to this. So you start that with a very basic orientation. It's called minimalist training. There was one approach. This is how you turn the system on, and this is how you start. That's it. We don't go into all these various other functions and so on. Okay, so what do? You start doing your work. So the person who said, I'm going to write letters, they start writing letters. The one who writes a memo starts writing a memo. That's it. And as they're going along, they said, well, how do I copy this and so on? So here's some functionalities come up. Then you would have a mini lecture. Well, this is how you do it. So what happens is that people are actually learning. And then we did a study on what we call best practices. By the way, I can ask you about what do you think of best practices? This is completely as an aside.
Well, I don't know if you know this, but we are actually, me and Matti and some other people are trying to come up with some tentative best practices for ADR or something like that. But in that case, I say tentative ones. I mean, best practices is it's good if you want to accomplish something very fast, and you need to do that. But best practices can also be, they can also isolate something that is more, let's say, fluid in its nature, such as ADR. If you take ADR, for instance, what I like with ADR framework is that it is loosely typed. That comes, I mean, when we do these studies in that project, Matti, we ask people how they have used ADR in practice. And they have different stories, all of them. And that shows that ADR can be used for different kind of research in different contexts, because it is not as formalized as many of the stage gate models within, for instance, the ESR are. And if we provide best practices, I mean, standardized ones, then perhaps people will only start using ADR or not using ADR at all, because they get scared about, you must follow these best practices in order to conduct proper ADR, for instance.
By the way, please feel free to say what you don't like about ADR. Because everyone says, well, I like about this. There must be something that you don't like, which is, think about it. Well, instantly, you talk about Matti, and this is paper 2 that you wrote with him.
That is one of them, yeah.
Yeah, and then you have, this is about this author declaration. Who did. So, for example, paper 1, we have got, the first author was the main contributor to the text, the second author did that, so on and so forth. So then I read about this Padre. There are 3 authors. And he said the first author was the main contributor to the text, and was also responsible for data collection and analysis. So which is what you did. However, the very idea of Padre was conceived and proposed by the second author of the paper, which is L. Bernardson, and said, through a rather interesting encounter and conversation that took place at the airport in Dublin, Ireland, after a conference. So what did the third author do? It's not listed. Is it did he do anything? Or was he present at that?
Well, Matti is very good at Matti is good at cutting text, nevertheless. But, yeah, he did a lot, but I didn't mention that in that particular statement.
So, well, maybe you should issue an errata. But Matti is not somebody who minds about these things.
No, I don't.
Where were we though? So we're talking about the best practice. Just as an aside, by the way, I do not like the term best practice.
No.
And I'll tell you why. It might be. The reason is that best practices do not emerge in a vacuum. There's histories and so on that actually goes in. You can replicate the instrumental, that aspect, but you cannot replicate the history. So that's the reason why. Although I have written a paper with best practice, and now I don't believe in that anymore. However, this thing about formulating a training as a particular content, the job. So not to say that I'm actually training something on whatever it is, but so in your particular case, if you say, well, this is a training session on integration work. And oh, by the way, we are going to use this system. So the system becomes secondary in that, What is that you're trying to achieve that actually gets into it? Now, apply Habermas that you've actually got into this particular thought. So you talk about this, then the use of the system That is a very, sort of instrumental thing. And you are in this first world, object world, if you will.
Yes.
But all these other worlds that actually come into this particular stuff. It's a very simple thing of doing it, but it's a very simple way of actually organizing it. Or thinking, structuring it, if you will.
Yes.
ADR cycles. Actually, I have some questions about how are we doing for time? We're doing okay for time? Time?
It's okay.
Yeah, okay. Because this is where I decide. This is, every time I have something I call either a flexible or a stretchable thing. I can spend 1 minute on this ADR cycle, I can spend 1 hour on these cycles. So, specifics about it. And it has to do with, coming back to this training. So this literature, you didn't look at that training literature, did you? Or you didn't?
Which one of them?
Yeah, I mean the one.
The ones you're mentioning?
Yes.
I was looking at a different set of literature.
Yeah.
Yes.
So this might be actually, incidentally, I don't know, maybe it has something to do with that literature because you're the fourth PhD student I have questioned this. How come you didn't look at this other literature? But in the other 3 cases, I could send it back and say, well, look at it. And they did find it very relevant afterwards in what it would be. But there has been some work that has been done, which actually brings me to this, jumping a little bit ahead. If you say, well, here are some things that are new, and then this is an insight that you actually got out of this. So one was this role of philosophy in IS research. And there is a editorial that's going to actually come out. I can say that, right?
Yeah, sure.
Oh,
I think it's online.
Oh, it's online. Yeah, you can actually read it. I had actually thought of reading this last night, but I was so sleepy I didn't read it. But the point there was that you have to have the point that you make about the importance of philosophy, and so on, which I buy, by the way, in that you have to have that thought, because it's a bit like this. When you talk about theoretical thinking in design, so, well, you just go ahead and you try something that actually works. There's no theory behind it. And you step up a little bit from that. You say, well, it's designed based on some theory. This is some theory that's ingrained in it, right? And that's what you're doing. And even the what we call this EVA, we call this strategy 1, where the whole point is to actually do it. Even there, the role of the theory is it's almost like you test. There's an implicit hypothesis that you're actually testing, and that's nothing to do with the. I shouldn't say nothing. It's very little to do with the artifact itself, but the theory that has gone behind it. You're actually testing that. Well, if it actually works, so there you go. It's something that's designed. So this particular theory is useful for this design, right? And of course, if you actually create that theory out of it. So anyway, the role of that theory. But even when you look at this theory, or you look at what I call theory-like, look at the past literature and the concept. So it can give you some answers about that. But if you go deeper into philosophy, then you ask this question of why you are doing it, what lies behind that, and so it's a sort of understanding aspect. So that's, it's admirable in that sense. However, you know that when you say everything is good, there's a but that is coming. So I always wait and say, man, Amir comes in. I believe it was in 1982, at the first, we can't say ISIS anymore, ICIS. There was a paper by somebody called Peter King, one of the old, founders of the field who have been around. And Peter King actually then he became a consultant, made tons of money, and then he would just show up. But he had this thing called what he calls reference disciplines of information systems. So, the one that comes to mind is behavioral sciences is a reference discipline, computer science is a reference discipline, economics, and many others. And among the sociology, psychology, and among all of this was philosophy. So it's, and then he was actually talking about something called cumulative tradition. So if I build my work on yours, so there's a cumulative tradition in the field. You know, we always argue that, well, this is not relevant. Practice doesn't have to listen to us. But if you look at individual papers for relevance, that's wrong. You cannot. But if you look at the body of work, this is a body of work on, you know, in civic orientation, then the body of work will inform practice in the end. So, but for that, you have to have a cumulative tradition, not like in one-shot studies in there and so on and so forth. So you're talking about that. So that's the reason why I mentioned all these different areas.
Yes.
You know. But for your next PhD, maybe you want to look at these different aspects. Your friend Devinder has two. Okay, so kernel theories on this. So you have listed a whole bunch of them. Which one do you think actually informed your work and which are ingrained in your artifact? Now I know that if I go back to this, yeah, you have. But how many of these are actually in there? So if somebody comes up and takes a look at your system and do some kind of a philosophical reverse engineering, what will that person see?
Well, they won't find philosophy, that's one thing for sure, because this is a tricky question.
Well,
But the answer is quite, it depends on who is looking. We can start from there.
Well, let's say another philosophy nerd, like the one that comes to mind is Devinder.
Okay.
You know him, I know him.
Yes.
So he starts looking at it, what will he find?
Yes. He starts looking at this platform, he starts working with it, and then suddenly he discovers that, well, this is quite a simple artifact to use. Even I can understand this as a Norwegian citizen from Nepal. Why is that? And then he starts to look at the form, look at the content, the graphical design, and from there on, he goes on to the interaction process. I mean, what happens when I
But
push
he's
this
not a
button?
designer, right?
Yes, I know.
Yeah, so...
Yeah. Yes, in the business of ICT. And then he starts thinking about things that have with language to do. Well, this language, if you translate this Swedish word, for instance, or sentence to Nepali, it doesn't come out good at all. I must think in order to understand what this system is trying to say. Then he starts thinking about, is this perhaps of course, the first thought he comes up with it's because the system lacks the proper functionality to translate that. But then he starts to orient himself towards other groups, core sites in that platform. For instance, to the Somali group or to the Persian group and so forth. And he starts to see some differences in terms of content. Because he starts to see, well, they have adapted different content and form to their sites. Of course, this is obvious, one may think. This is a natural thing to do if you are administrator of one site. You most likely always do not want to have the same site as another two. And this whole process, I would say, is just not about sitting there as a static person following a manual to do all these things, but you're oriented towards these different doors and these different corners and so forth in the platform. And if you're a person as Devinder, for instance, then you start philosophizing about this. What does this mean? For instance, from the perspective of technology ready to hand or present to hand, what is this? And why? And how can I understand the interaction process from these perspectives and so forth? And this enriches your imagination as a scholar and a writer, because we need to publish good theories. We need to produce good theories in order to publish.
I don't know.
Yeah. So that's one way of answering it.
Well, you know, this number, by the way, I know that he will immediately start looking for affordances, and that's another thing.
Yeah.
He sees the world only through affordances now.
And critical realism,
Yeah,
yes.
these two are his,
Yeah.
he's lost other views of the world. But as a designer, if you say, okay, I want to see this, and I said, how am I going to build a similar system and so on, which is why we have this notion of design principles, which you, for some reason, did not go into.
No.
You know what, can you just explain?
Yes.
But as an ADR person, that's the first thing I'd be looking for.
Yes. Well, I didn't like to use the word principle in this case, because principle in my world, something more universal, which you can apply. For instance, I train martial arts. We use body principles in order to generate power when we attack or defend and so forth. That is applicable for everyone, by the way. But design principles, that's something that, in my opinion, especially in the context of DSR, we tend to get oriented towards producing design principles, but never using them or evaluating them in practice. And by the way, one of my newest Desirist papers is about that. We try to solve that by providing an evaluation framework for design principles in practice.
Oh, so you are the author?
Me and two other persons.
Oh, geez. There goes the anonymity.
But it's already accepted. Yeah, so you don't need to worry.
So, was Bendik was he handling this?
Who?
Bendik Bygstad?
I don't know.
I don't know. Anyway, now I can tell you that I was, especially after you said you're martial arts, artist and so on, that I did, I reviewed that. But the thing about the design principles issue is that when you say it's sort of a general, and I think that paper made a really nice case about how to evaluate and so on. It's not that it's generalizable at a very broad.
Yes.
It's generalizable. It is generalizable to the class of problems or the class of solutions. It's always to a class.
Yeah, but this is where I have a problem with this, you see, because if you look at Van Aken's paper from 2004 or something like that, where he tries to describe what the definition of a design principle is, then I think it's quite logically well to formulate design principles or define it through that perspective. But the problem with design principles is that in order to understand formulated design principles, you need to translate that, encrypt that in some sense. And we have a researcher called Leona Chandra Kruse. She's been writing home very much about how to transport design knowledge.
I was going to bring her up right
Yes.
now.
And going from the known to the unknown by designing, but also then going back to the known by providing design principles, because design principles capture that story and then, bring it towards someone else in order to address a class of problems. But it's very difficult to do in practice. So the thing I have a problem with is that we say that we want to do that in practice. We want to accomplish this in practice, but we seldom see any evidence of that in the DSR literature, I would say. Or perhaps I have missed something, but it's very difficult to trace that people have actually used design principles.
Well, I actually supervised a thesis which had got the design principles. It's by a lady called Sophie Weston.
Oh yeah, I interviewed her for one of the...
Interestingly, whenever I introduced her to my American colleague, I said, you know her family, they own all these hotels, and she's standing there. So don't say that. I said, come on, let that be. At the same time, I introduced Martin Santana, one of my students, as the nephew of Carlos Santana. And immediately said, oh yeah, I grew up listening to his music. So the point about when you said the design principles in that sense is that if you really get to the some design principle that people come out with, it's ridiculous. It should be easy to use. Come on. I mean, if you have a design principle that this system should be difficult to use, that would get my attention. A long time ago, a friend of mine wanted to do a study on this. People were talking about user interfaces, friendly user interfaces. He said, no, you should have unfriendly user interfaces. And his basis was that this is how you learn.
Yeah.
He was unconsciously using this notion of breakdown, but he didn't actually talk about it. So it's like you type something, and then error message comes up, okay, whatever this error, fix it. He said, no, the error message should be, you idiot, why did you now immediately get this attention? He never followed it up, but I thought it was a very interesting way of looking at it. So, and so, that is why I wondered that you worked with Leona,
Yes.
but you were still not, you still didn't want to talk about design principles.
Well, we have had lots of heated debates about that, she and I, so we're not just, I mean, as soon as I start see some progress in this, I think Leona's doing a great job, for instance, by, she wrote a paper about design principles, that's just last year, I think it was.
Is it with the form and the,
Yes,
the grammar?
yeah. But then again, this whole, if we just step back, as philosophers do, and try to understand this from a critical perspective. Because sometimes, as Heidegger said, Dasein is always oriented towards the future, right? So we're doing things without already reflecting upon why we are doing this. Well, as soon as you step back and put yourself in a comfortable situation, and other people as well, and try to understand why we're doing these things, then we learn something, I would say. So what I've learned about this design principle is that as soon as we stop advocating that design principles are useful in practice, that's my basic argument, then I will buy this concept. But if you talk about guidelines, for instance, then it becomes a little bit loosely defined. Because the term principle, as I said, for me, is something that is, okay, it's normative, it provides prescriptive knowledge in best cases, but in the end, if it doesn't lead you, everyone, from point A to point C, and also not missing point B in order to accomplish D, then this whole notion of design principles sometimes collapses.
But see, the design principles should be prescriptive.
Yes.
I mean, definitely, and that if you can achieve that level of, you know, if it's not a prescriptive level, then you really haven't got, then you end up with this mishmash of, you know, normative and the statements and so on and so forth. But some design principles are actually quite eye-opening, if you, very few, I would admit that is the case. But I mean, you know, I have got master's students at Lincoln, and they can't actually come up with design principles. This is very fine. But the thing is that a lot of them, at the end of any design research thesis, well, what is the contribution? Well, so, we have come up with a design theory. And they use Shirley Gregor's, you know, that model. And my friend Tero here is a great believer in that. So whenever we write a paper on this, we say, okay, Tero, now you start Gregorizing this. So it's become a verb now. Do you know how to do that? But the problem that I have with that is that, well, last time I saw one in that, he had design principles. Then he had this design theory, which is what this Gregor, it was like 3 pages.
Yeah.
So well, I'm used to theories that are not 3 pages. You know, it's something that could be, you know, intuitive, if you will. So that's fine.
But by the way, I use actually design principles in one case, and it is in the context of my design theory.
Right.
But there I presented as a constitutive part of the theory.
You did,
yes.
Except it's not in the form that Leona would have written. That's why I was. So you did, in a paper you did, I mean, as a whole, so if I use ADR, the people might be expected to see design principles again, or a reflection on what you said, which would have been fine. So, well, yeah, you would have expected to see design principles, but here's the reason why I'm not doing it.
Yes.
Because you philosophize a lot. So you might as well philosophize there. But by the way, when people say philosophize, and I was just raising this question today, especially in sports you'll find it. So let's say you're martial arts, you know, so you go in and then, let's say somebody, you win and your opponent loses, and the opponent is asked, how do you feel? The journalists ask all the silly questions. I've been beaten up. Oh, I feel fine now. Or sometimes they start blaming, oh, the weather was not good, this and that. Well, some would say, and this is how the journalists will report, well, he took it philosophically. What does that mean? How do you take something philosophically? So my ex is that they say something like, well, it's a fight or it's a game, there's a winners, there are losers, so there will be, I happen to be a loser today. This is how they describe taking something philosophical. And the same thing about when you say philosophizing. You philosophize, and then, you know, Devinder has this name on his door. It says, I want to stop philosophizing, but I can't. K-A-N-T, so I think we philosophize in that sense. And you have done a lot of philosophy here. I'm not going to hammer us a lot right now, you know, because it might be. But let's talk about Heidegger. Let's get serious. Let's talk about Heidegger.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Let's start with Dasein. So you have this concept of digital Dasein.
Yes, I have.
Honestly, I don't understand it.
No.
What is it? Your definition of digital Dasein, which is it's about, basically, it's in the digital world, if you will. And by the way, when I was reading your the notion of digital Dasein, and even before you got to the this different type of technology that you have, this matrix, I said, oh yeah. I immediately started thinking about avatars, virtual reality. It's a sort of a beam.
Yes.
So am I wrong?
That's one part of the answer.
What, wrong?
No, that you're right.
Yeah.
But actually, I have been reconfiguring my understanding about digital Dasein. I'm in the process of writing a new paper about that, because my original definition was, first of all, coined in 2014, and then I've only been a Ph.D. student for 6 months or 7 months or something like that.
You're philosophizing in this.
Yes, but I didn't.
No,
No, I didn't. I have done philosophy before. That's one of my passions. I've been reading lots of philosophy before. But the definition of digital Dasein was come up then, and then there I understood digital Dasein as a way of addressing this whole nature of the problematic nature of being here, being there, being asynchronously here, synchronously here and there, or anywhere. And from that perspective, what becomes presence? I mean, what is presence in that particular way of expressing Dasein? So I try to inform that digital Dasein is basically not only these avatars that you are talking about, you know, virtual reality or the virtual world, but it's also attached to our notion of presence, because as you were saying in the beginning of this seminar, I can be physically present here, but I can also indicate that I'm present somewhere else. For instance, on Messenger we have this green light bulb, right? It says that I'm present, but in fact I'm not. The Messenger, I've just not gone offline, that's why it's shining green as it is, but it's indicating to someone that I'm present. So what happens here is that Dasein, Heidegger's original understanding of Dasein, becomes somewhat extended into this digital era of reality. Because we are moving constantly towards being here, being there, but also not only being here, being there, but also doing things in different worlds, I would say. So digital Dasein is Dasein, but entailed into a digitalized era, I would say. That's my best way of putting it right now.
But it's still me, right? So if you say you're there in that, it's not a being by itself. They say if is your digital design is you in a digitalized form.
Well, this
But
is
it's you as a design.
now, this is a very good question, because here we need to understand what being is. When I use the term being from the perspective of Dasein, I'm not talking about a particular being per se, or a thing per se. By the way, things are not considered as Dasein. But being is, as Dreyfus said in his paper from '94, I think it was, Hubert Dreyfus was one of the American philosophers who wrote many
Is it
papers.
the father or the son?
They were two brothers, Hubert and the other one, I don't remember what his name was.
Or is it the Holy Ghost? Is it?
He is the Holy Ghost now, because he passed away 1 year ago, something like that. But the point I was trying to make here is that he said that Dasein is the activity itself. So it's not about the being per se, but it's about being. And that is a totally different thing to my read about Heidegger. So when you're the activity itself, you're not stopping and trying to come up with a rational formula about how to drive a car. And now I need to put my left hand there, right hand there in order to do so. You're intuitively doing that. Which also goes back to Dreyfus and Dreyfus' model about knowledge progression. You go from being a novice into advanced beings, into an intuitive being, into an expert and so forth. So here, my notion of being is not a being per se,
Yeah.
but being. That is a totally different thing.
The act of being, it's like, by the way, when we read Heidegger's being and time, right, we have to read both together.
Yes.
It's a being and time, it's not being and then it's time. So it is like, so right now, are you a Dasein?
A Dasein. I am Dasein, yes,
So-
I am Dasein.
How many Daseins do you see in this room?
Well, I wouldn't put it that way, you see.
Because why? I have the advantage of questioning you, and you have to answer.
Well, I mean, I'm not starting going to count everyone here, but I don't interpret and understand the notion of Dasein through that perspective. Because Dasein is always. And then, I mean, we could draw this to a pseudo-scientific conversation.
No, well, okay, now what about,
Yeah.
this is an authentic Dasein,
Yeah.
inauthentic Dasein.
Yes.
So, from my understanding, by the way, I find Heidegger very difficult, and I keep on reading, since I'm reading, in preparation for this, I read a whole bunch of stuff, and on the train, unfortunately I fell asleep, so we didn't actually report very well. But this, sometimes I get distracted. The authentic, so you are, in my opinion, in this case, you're an authentic Dasein. Otherwise, you would not have been able to produce all this stuff.
Okay.
Yeah. But it's also the notion of when you say being present. So when you talk about this time, there's also a question of mood.
Yes.
It's a very big part of it. So if you get annoyed and so on and so forth, or what it is. And then there's the notion of flow, which is not a Heideggerian concept, but it comes from, now how do you pronounce his name? I know Samir Charity taught me how to pronounce his name. Yes, Chick sent me high.
Chick sent me high.
Yeah.
Okay. I never heard of that. Yeah.
Well, there's this Czech guy, and so that's how you remember his name. Chick sent me high.
Yeah, that was how I heard that as well.
So he's got this notion of flow, which a colleague of mine and somebody I've worked with, called James Webster, used in her dissertation, which is something with training actually, literature. So what is important in training? We had a panel a long time ago. Is it, do you have to give cognitive, knowledge, or is it motivation? But she said, well, just put people in flow and then they'll learn. This is what it will be. So you're immersed in that situation. So this is where it comes close to this notion of being,
In the world. Yes.
Exactly, being in the world, and so being in the training or whatever it would be. Yeah. So all the other cognitive aspect that goes into it, and this is what I have, and this is my fault because I come from this cognitive psychology background. So as I'm being and so on, so I find it hard to believe, honestly.
Yeah.
That it's already at hand. You just you don't even think about it, and so on. Fine, but a lot of this automation comes because your processes have gone automated. So I do not think when I'm driving, as you said, you know, because I've driven it so many times, the whole act has become,
Yeah.
you know, just as a flow. So in that sense, I am my presence there, I'm a Dasein in that particular moment,
Yeah.
in a particular mode.
Mm.
That's what, the richness of this concept of Dasein that actually comes in. And also, my orientation. You know, I'm in present right now, but it's not, it just didn't come out of it. There's a past that's involved.
Yes,
I'm not
yes.
invoking it. And I'm projecting to the future. So maybe if you're driving, you probably, well, I need to go someplace, or whatever is the case, or whatever that goes. But that makes an authentic Dasein in that sense. Very rich concept. How does it actually help in your this designing for integration work? Other than thinking about that, is it something, if it's a kernel philosophy, does it actually inform my design?
It should. Because
How?
it boils down to how we see human beings, how we conceive them. In this particular case of civic orientation, we have newcomers that do not know the language. Some of them are academic, some of them are analphabets. You need to put them and orient them towards a direction which hopefully leads to social integration or integration per se. The fundamental conception about who these human beings are, why they are here, is important to analyze and understand. If we just consider them as beings that are temporarily here, to get some money in order to attend this program, and we really don't know what happens to them afterwards, if they get integrated or not, then we conceive them as some passive actors in that sense. We don't conceive them as having the ability to become authentic Daseins, as you would say. And then when you go to the e-learning context, I mean, the e-learning literature has a background towards what is presence and how can we, for instance, mediate social presence or cognitive presence, teaching presence, without detaching the human element in those virtual environments, e-learning environments. And all this, in my opinion, I argue it boils down to how we conceive the human being in these particular cases. If we don't step back and analyze this from a more fundamental perspective, we will most likely theorize local theories that reach us to some degree of explaining how human beings behave in virtual environments, how they learn, and why don't they learn, from local learning theories that, okay, that's fine, you accumulate knowledge to that particular body of knowledge, but in order to actually, I mean, if you want to take the pH of a Ph.D. serious, you need to understand this more fundamentally. So in my case, I mean, it helps me to inform the design that affords these possibilities that an authentic Dasein can and may possess.
So you are getting into this, here we are, this understanding about that, right? It's here in table 34, you talk about rationale for contextualizing Heidegger's terminology. You talk about existential understanding.
Yes.
And you talk about existential understanding. By the way, just as an aside, and I'm not a philosopher like you, but here's what I am, and you might think it's a very trivial way of actually, or even trivializing philosophy. It's not. What makes philosophy difficult to read is this. So they're looking at a concept which is very difficult, very complex thing they're trying to understand, right? Philosophers. And in doing so, and the logic is the language, if you will, in that sense. So you have to make arguments very logically.
Yes.
So this follows, that follows, and so on.
But with Heidegger, it's not like that.
Oh, we'll come to Heidegger in a minute. But if you do it like that, and then you said, but Heidegger is, we'll come to that in a moment. So you have to have, as you go along, to make the link, you need a language. And at some point in time, there is no language because you're going. So you know what to do?
Come up with a new line.
That's right.
Yes.
And then, I don't know if how people will take it. Unfortunately, a lot of them are Germans. So they come up with these German words and German verbs, and then you have to go into these nuances to actually understand it. So I was saying to people, actually philosophers, I was telling the story to Pat about, well, now it's getting serious. And then I realized that there was a classmate of mine, he had two terms. He said serious and serious. Oh, what is that? He said serious is when, this is serious, what we are doing. Serious is, well, I have to look like a, serious person, and everybody who says it's not really that much fundamental in that sense. But you see, this sort of things happens a lot. In some, you understand, so, difference and developments, so all of that. There's a meaning towards this. So this is where it would come to. And now you're saying that Heidegger was not like this.
Yes, what he did was he invented a language that allowed him to express these things that...
Dasein is a good example.
Oh yeah, or Ontik, what does that mean, for instance?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we're having trouble understanding ontology, and now we're the Ontik. But here's what I see some of it, this Heidegger rubbing in you into this. So one of the questions I had about this was, why? You have this Dasein, and you have this question, do you have any answers to this or not? And let me make the statement first and let's see how you react. And it seems to me that there are a lot of questions that you haven't answered, which you have actually raised, and you have left to this. But see, that was what was sort of a criticism of, or a critique of Heidegger, but also his, how do you call it, this is why people like Heidegger. It's not so much as that he struggled with providing consistent answers, at least to me. I don't know, maybe it's a bit clearer to you. But what was endearing about him was not so much as this consistent answers, but that he was unrelentless, or relentless, no, unrelentless, maybe this new term, but unrelentless. He was relentless in his search for it. Yes. So I see that characteristic in you, that you are on the search, and you come up with all this, and in doing so, the questions might be raised about this. So you bring in Heidegger, the digital Dasein, and you bring in Habermas, but you have not actually used them. You see, your Habermas paper was based on, well, you analyze that OLP1. Well, it hasn't got this, it hasn't got that, but this is how it could be used. And then in the discussion, you say, well, we haven't used it, but it could inform. The same thing with the digital Dasein concept. We have that, what is it called? The model. Yeah, the model and how it would be. And then you said how virtual reality actually is based on this. But it's, again, it is not evident. So that was why I asked the previous question about would you see it.
Well, I need to comment that.
Yeah.
Because the main research purpose of my thesis is to problematize and understand aspects of design integration.
Exactly.
And in that sense, I really use it.
Absolutely. and that is why I read that word problematize very interestingly, and that's what it would be. And I agree with that. That this is fine. Although, if I put my ADR hat, I would say, we don't problematize. I mean, although one might say that, it's always said that a good research raises as many questions as it answers what it would be. So, if I throw this at you, and I've been dying to throw this question at many people, these concepts that actually, your philosophical output, if you will, in these dynamics and so on, did it this knowledge creation, was it based on your work in ADR and actually because let's remember one thing, that in ADR you have to design an artifact. So is it a direct output of your work with actually designing, or is it reflecting on it?
I think it's both. Because one of the essential traits of ADR, from my understanding at least, is that the iterations, the cycles, deal with what I said before, emergence. And emergence in my world is that you maybe have awareness of what the initial problem is, but through guided emergent principle, for instance, you are available for signals that allow you to expand your problem solution awareness. And that is one part of problematizing the outcomes which we already have from one cycle, but also to understand how to refine them. For instance, go from alpha prototype to beta prototype. We don't just add a new button from alpha prototype, and they call the new prototype a beta prototype because we have a new button. Perhaps people do that, I don't know, but I didn't. Then you ingrain your understanding from the previous cycle into that prototype, but you also, through that process, problematize an understanding about what new kind of features, for instance, the artifact shall withhold, and for what purpose. So I don't detach the problematizing activity from the ADR cycle. I see it as a highly ingredient one within the cycle.
So you're basically creating new knowledge, but not necessarily tied to this, the actual building of it. So if you go back to this notion of ADR, so we come out with design principles. So these emerge from, directly related from this, your BIE cycles, if you would. Well, this is a do it like this, do it like that, etc., etc.
Also through reflectional learning,
yeah,
is a part of that.
That is a part of it. But I find it very interesting that in your first, in this figure somewhere. Now I'm using two figures, two publications. Oh, this is better. Yeah, the schematic of figure 6.
Yes.
Right in here. So you have the previous version of ADR without this arrows, and then you have something on the top. And if you think about this as a schematic, is it the pre-activities, so these are actually inside it, but you're showing it in the not fine. And then you have this formalization of learning, etc. Right?
Yes.
And then on the side, you have this theoretical contribution, which somewhere, it's not a formalization of learning, but it is something which came out of it.
Yes.
Is there any significance in that?
Well, the significance is that, what I try to say here is that I separate between different kind of theories, because the whole point of the schematic is that I try to, in some sense, unpack and go beyond just that original figure of ADR and show actually what kind of theories that can go into.
No, I'm not talking about the top one, I'm talking about the bottom.
The bottom one?
Yes.
Theoretical contributions.
Yeah.
Yeah, so what was your question?
Not put it as a part of formalization of learning.
Yeah.
But as
in the process, yes, it is in the process of theorizing.
Okay.
Yes, that's my take on it.
And
Yes.
so your your digital Dasein actually falls in that category.
Yes.
Okay. Fine. Now, here's the question that I've been dying to ask. If that is the case, would you call ADR a methodology, or is it an epistemology?
Oh, I've been actually thinking about that.
Oh, you have?
Yes.
Good.
First of all, I would say that, me and Matti had a talk about this. Is ADR a methodology or is it a method? And then we come up with, but it is actually a method, not a methodology in that sense. But going to your question, doing epistemology cannot be separated with doing ontology, I would say, in this case, because ADR advocates a proactive stance of the researcher. You are proactive as a researcher, you're not just observing things, right? And when you do ontology, you try to understand your own role in the world, as, for instance, Heidegger would say. But doing epistemology is that you start questioning what is the nature of knowledge in this particular case. So what becomes significant as a knowledgeable outcome of ADR, or what is significant for ingraining some kind of theory into the ADR framework, as opposed to some other framework. What ADR allows here, this is my initiate answer. This is my initiate answer now. Perhaps I'm wrong. But what I would say what ADR does is that it affords, you were talking about affordances. Because it is loosely defined, some people get actually confused by its loosely defined nature, but I don't. So what it does is that it affords you to not only build products, it allows you to do epistemology in some sense. Well then of course, you're not perhaps deliberately aware of this when you're conducting ADR cycles. How could you? If you go around and ask people, are you doing epistemology, they will actually, perhaps, I would say, out of the interviews we've been doing with people who use ADR in practice, I've been hearing this as an underlying theme. That's one of my take of what's significant was using ADR in practice. So yes, in some way we are doing epistemology, but I haven't said that in this thesis.
Okay. Well, let's talk about it. This is something that I've been sort of leaning towards, and I've been actually telling Mati, let's write a paper about it. This is what we do. So, all right, so now let's get serious. No, not serious. This is the last aspect. The other aspect of Heidegger, and especially his, the questions concerning technology.
Yes.
My entry into Heidegger, if that's the right term, was through that. Because it is, I find it very, very appealing, especially when it comes to when design. Now, many years ago, I've forgotten which year it is, but it probably was the previous century when we talk about 90-something or other. There was a special issue of information technology and people, if I'm not wrong. I couldn't, on Heidegger, and how Heidegger's influences it. I go back and actually read this. And when you, to me, that's why I asked you this question about how does it actually inform design, or the role of the designer. Let me just throw out one quotation from it, and then you see what it would be, So you talk about these various causes and so on and so forth. Let's keep that aside. Have you read that?
That particular paper, I'm not sure.
Okay, but okay, so one term he says was this, that when a designer designs something, right?
Yeah.
Once it's designed, he sort of starts it on his journey. That's it. All right, I have now designed you this, please go on your way. You have your own, existence and so on. And then that is used by somebody or other. But at that time, I have actually lost my ownership of it, if you will. So it will be shaped in many ways. So I have used that in affordance, except that all the reviewers hated it, so we had to cut it out. But we have it written somewhere, but in some place we'll use it. So if you lead it on, and so I'm just talking from the affordance perspective. I think it's easier to explain. So I designed this, glass, and there was a time when we used to say we designed affordances, but now we are so much in all of this word for, so we designed 4 affordances, right? We designed this so that you can drink, it is drinkability, and so on and so forth. By the way, I have to tell you the story about affordances because Gibson uses this term, chair affords sittability, he calls it, people can sit on it. So Devinder, who I worked with in something, his mother asked him, "What do you do?" He said, "Oh, I do research." "You do research on what?" So he said, "Well, I do research on affordances." So she doesn't understand affordance. "What is affordance?" He said, "Mother, when you see that chair," he said, "What is it? This is for sitting." She looked at it. It took you 3 years to realize that it is for sitting. So this is the notion of affordance that actually comes in. But anyhow, if I design this for, and this is drinkability, and start designing it in a particular way. And then you and I are having a discussion on Dasein. You are drinking water, I'm drinking water. And then you suddenly get mad at me. And you really get mad, you pick up this thing and you throw it at me. You hit me. Now the person who designed this for drinkability affordance never thought of it as a weapon.
Yes.
But you have discovered something.
Yeah.
And you afford it. Now, somebody might build upon this and say, "Oh, you know what? This can also be used as a weapon." So I would start adding, maybe spikes or something like that to create maximum damage. So this notion of when you design something, with whatever affordance something in mind, and you let it out, and then it is actually, what is that term? Appropriated. I hate that word, but there you go, by different people. And it takes a completely new meaning. But it's not me who owns it anymore. So this is where this notion of guided emergence, it could be complete emergent,
Yes.
right? But it could be guided in terms of that somebody else actually comes in and do that.
Yeah.
So to me, that aspect of Heidegger was very, very relevant in that. So have you thought about it in this sense? Or
I have.
I actually see it, yeah.
Yes, well, of course. Yes, I have. I mean, it's inevitable to not read his take on the technology, but I have unfortunately not incorporated that explicitly into this thesis.
Oh, you don't have to.
Yes.
But is it something, now that we're talking about it, with this reflection, do you see any relevance?
Yes,
How-
especially in relation to this typology of social actions, in terms of Habermas typology. Actually, philosophers don't agree. I mean, if they would read my thesis, they would say you can never use Habermas and Heidegger together. And I would say, yes, you can, if you're interested in designing things. Because in this particular case, Heidegger's view on technology opens up upon how affordances are emerging in their nature. But in order to discover this, as you say, we need to act, we need to be proactive. And that is some sense of knowledge a posteriori, or whatever, if you use those words. So in the case of this open learning platform for social integration, how we can afford social actions, but also how this is emerging, and how we discover this in a virtual world. For instance, when we conduct crimes in society, we get punished. But in this virtual world, we just get punished in that world. We don't go to jail physically. So in order to afford this understanding through actions, I could use Heidegger's take on technology, yes.
Also, the role of the designer. In fact, it's in every, this whole when we talk about Habermas, I started thinking about the public sphere, but whatever is the case in here, which might be something that, I'm not going to overburden you with more theories, although I saw affordance somewhere, and in some cases you talk about the design paradoxes.
Yes.
There is the concept of dialectics would be very useful in that. And if you really want to, there's a very good paper that came out in February of EJIS this year on this dialectics. But anyway, these are, you see this from different lights, and then you get into that, and that actually happens. So in terms of paradoxes, these paradoxes were resolved in some way because there were systems that were actually built. So what is interesting when you actually look back is also that things that actually work, although they should work, if you will. If you say, well, this is happening, that is happening, and they say, well, we live with paradoxes. We all live with paradoxes all the time. And then, we actually resolve it. I remember a colleague of mine who is not a researcher at all, and we were talking about dialectics, and he said, what are you talking about? So dialectics? Come on, there's another one of those. What is that, you tell me? So I explained to him, and he said, well, I do that all the time, I live. I said, well, this is how it resolved these issues. So in conclusion, we've been here for a very long time, and we can go on and on about this. But the notion of philosophy, so let me end with this question first.
Okay.
Do you see yourself as a philosopher or as thinking philosophically?
No.
Or is there a difference?
It is. You see, when we talk about doing philosophy in a different discipline, sometimes it becomes very shallow. Someone says, well, he dressed like a philosopher, he talks like a philosopher, he thinks a philosopher, but he's not. He doesn't have a Ph.D. in philosophy. So, from that perspective, I'm not a philosopher, I'm not a professional philosopher. But as I mentioned...
But you're a doctor, depending on...
Yes,
and that was going to be a doctor of philosophy.
Yes, and that was what I was going to come to. Perhaps in some person's ears this might sound like a cliche, but the PH of a PhD stands for philosophy. Well, so what, people said. Do we need to learn philosophy in order to take a PhD? Evidently not. But I do, because I had philosophy as a particular knowledge interest for more than 1 decade. So it is, for me, it would be impossible to not incorporate philosophy into my research. And when I find it useful, which it is, from various perspectives, we have a problem in our discipline with theorizing, coming up with original theories. I don't know if you agree with me about that, but perhaps some people say we don't need theories in our discipline. Obviously we do, then we can perhaps not publish good papers. Science relies heavily on producing theoretical knowledge that accumulates understanding about phenomena. But in our case, we are producing also theories that guide us to design and produce artifacts. So, I am not a professional philosopher in any sense, but I would be very uncomfortable with not having the ability to use philosophy in my research. And hopefully I would be highly uncomfortable to not get the opportunity to use philosophy in my own research. Because I think it enriches my imagination of coming up with these notions and ideas that goes along with information systems research, especially from a perspective of design, I would say.
See, well said. Yeah. But let me offer some caveats in here. The first caveat is that while I agree with you in that, what happens is that, there's also this, how shall I say, a norm, if you will, around. So there's a normative form of a thesis, if you will, and what it will. And people would look at what are the contribution, what is that, and so on and so forth, which you have to actually clarify. And if you take this approach, then it becomes difficult. It's not impossible, but it becomes difficult to actually, for somebody to actually recognize it. Oh, this is a thesis, this is God's contribution, and so on and so forth. So you can actually have a thesis which is very, in a formal, structured way. Of course, it will be very boring in many ways. I mean, we'd say that. So one thing that I like a lot about this is that it's like telling a story, and I understand that you got feedback based on this and how it would be. So it's like I wouldn't say confessional account, but this is how I actually did it. In one of my previous roles as an examiner, actually, it was one of the Ph.D. students. He had a very neat thesis, and he wrote that. So then I asked him, did you actually do it like this? And to his credit, he said, no. I did it, and so on. So it's not a need, for this process. So if there is a way of actually showing that this is how it went through, this is where I emerged. So you learn both. Now, what some people do is to write a reflection chapter in the end. So here's the whole story, this is how I actually do it. But you know, there are different ways. But it's so in that sense, that's great. When you talk about, but however, there are like expectations that come. It's not simply about, I'm talking about the structure, but also in terms of, you know, like knowledge contribution. So this is something, it's a designing for adaptable learning. You use area. So immediately someone will say, well, where are the design principles, where are the design theories, etc., you know? And that's a bit hard to actually determine. But you read through it, and then it all, you know, like I really enjoyed reading it. Although sometimes it's a bit hard, because by the way, I have another thing about all the terms that you use. So at some point you talk about philosophical contours of philosophy, rather than then you have kernel philosophy. When does that contour becomes a kernel? I don't know. There are many, many terms that we can actually talk about it. But this thing about philosophy, you know, one thing that and I tell Devinder a lot, because he's another one. And I remember one time we were going to write a paper with Bendik, and he said, well, nobody would be interested in this paper other than we philosophical nerds, you know, what it would be. So we talk about whether it's, you mentioned on a superficial level, actually people do it. And so okay, so is this person superficial or is this person not superficial? Then he said, no, this person is and that person is not, because this person goes very deep into that. So you go philosophy, you go really deep into that. You know what happens though? And I've seen a couple of cases. They go very deep and they don't come out. They stay there and you say, oh, please, you know, what can we actually do it? So, I'm glad that you said that you have got this philosophical thinking and you think of that, but that you're really not a philosopher. If you want to be, fine. But maybe you should be in another area, because there's always this institutional boundaries and institutional paradigms that actually come in. You know, when I used to do human-computer interaction, then actually I went for a job interview. So this is nothing to do with IS.
Yes.
There you go. See, you go in there. So do it, and if you want to turn into a philosopher, good luck. But maybe, you know.
Well, I wouldn't call myself a philosopher from that perspective, but what I enjoy with our discipline is that it is so open for different kind of introducing different kind of body of knowledge and using that. That's what we make it a multidisciplinary field, and that allows me to use philosophy. But I don't consider myself to be a professional philosopher in some sense.
And the other aspect of it is, this is the pragmatism me speaking, and designer. I always look for something like, you know, is it actually useful in that sense? It might be great sitting around having a beer and talking about what Devinder and I call symposium. You know the meaning of the word symposium?
No.
The origins?
No.
It's like those Greek poets used to sit down and drink. And that is it. So now we have symposium. Open about.
We have Unterballa symposium.
So the advantage of that is that, you know, we can say, well, we can serve alcohol. No, we're having a symposium. You know? So the point there was that. See, now I've forgotten what I was going to say. Where was I?
You're trying to convince me to be more careful with using philosophy. That's your take, yes.
So it is that it's well and great to have it, but in the end, as a designer, I'm always looking for
practical. Yeah.
I mean, how does it inform my design? How specifically it should be? Because otherwise, it's you know, you can have there's a mode of research called philosophical research. And you simply think about it. We did come up with a method called grounded analytic research, whatever it would be. But in the design field, and especially when people talk about, you know, what is, how relevant is it, and how are we affecting society and so on, that might be a moderating factor.
Well, I need to comment this before we wrap it up, is it okay? Is that I don't agree with you. And it's because we are not consultants in the end. We are not designers in the end. If we want to just consider how to design artifact as sufficiently efficiently as possible, then perhaps we should try to hire in professionals that work with this full time. We have some knowledge about design. Of course, I used to work as a systems designer programmer. But in the end, we are researchers. And in order to, I would say, inform the design process, it's also about understanding and problematizing the various aspects of designing for instance, integration work. And from that perspective, it is inevitable to not use theories in general. In my case, I use philosophy. But that it informs someone to actually design for integration work by reading my thesis. I highly doubt that. I highly doubt that even someone reads the whole thesis. So it's a paradox that is built into our field as researchers. So I mean, I don't buy that argument that we shouldn't come up with extremely abstract theories in order to inform something that can be highly pragmatic in its nature. I think that creates an interesting tension.
Okay, now we need to talk.
Well, we'll take it at a time.
What will you say? I hope I didn't give the impression that we do not need to do
Okay.
absolutely. I mean, but what you said about the consultant and all of this, so then I could go back. Isn't that what we're doing in ADR? We're distinguishing ourselves from actually, we're talking about how there was a particular case in a paper that I was actually reading about this, how practitioners got involved because there's all this other notion of mode to knowledge, you create knowledge when it's actually used. And so they described what ADR was. I said, well, this is great, but a practitioner would not be interested in that aspect.
No, that's true.
Absolutely. But for a practitioner, how do you act? So I don't know in what sense you're working with Matti about this, making it a practical in that sense. But if the scenario is something of this sort, if you are a practitioner of an organization, they have a problem that needs to be solved.
Yes.
No, maybe back. And then, if it's run of the mill, by all means go ahead and hire a consultant, and that's it. We have no role. But if it is something that is innovative, and so the practitioners do not have, that, then one way of getting involved with academia is to have this method. So get somebody who will be doing something like ADR.
Yes.
In which case we are doing this is a duality. It's like not duality. It's the dual. Okay, now that we're into duality, some people look at something like you do something and then you learn, and it's a dualism. There's a work and there's a knowledge. But what we are doing in ADR is actual duality. The actual act of solving the problem also creates knowledge. Yeah. And that is why, I know this area was, but when you said that you don't agree with me,
No, I misinterpreted you. I misinterpreted you in that sense.
Oh,
Yes.
because I would
I was just not agreeing with you in the terms of that highly abstract knowledge cannot inform the design. It depends on the dialectics and so many things. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
I believe and that every single work that we actually do does end up informing practice. It's not because people look, I do this and immediately next.
Yes.
No. It goes through a subtle, from, let's say you are very philosophical. And you talk to me, I'm philosophical bent, but I'm also a little bit into this. So I say, well, that's Amir's thoughts are very, very useful. Then I talk with someone who is, reflective and so on. And they use it. Ultimately, reach a consultant. One of my biggest rewards have always been, some old ex-student writes and says, you know what, that you were talking about this theory? I've used it in my this. But it somehow subtly finds its way. And this is how we do it. For a moment, I was afraid that you didn't quite understand. Yeah.
I have my understanding, yes.
I'm done. I'm done with it.
Really.
Thank you very much for your interesting dialogue, philosophic-oriented dialogue. And now we are asking for the examining committee the questions. you? Who would like to start?
I will like to start. Thanks both of you for interesting discussions. Okay, so we had a chance to talk about this as a manuscript a while ago. So I raised most of my questions already, I guess. But so this is one concrete thing that I still, that I want. So I'm looking at my recommendations for what you had to do.
Yes.
And one thing I suggested was that we needed a more thorough artifact description, and that the first paper that was in the previous version was a bit shallow. And your response to that was to take that paper out.
Yes. And I did that. And I brought in this, I think it's in the second cycle, I bring in the passage, a rather long passage about the artifact, which derives from the content of that paper, mostly, but also it complements with other things. But because that paper was a prototype paper, so that summed up the artifact quite good.
Right. Do you think that the artifact is described well enough?
To a certain degree, but I haven't described it, for instance, through, if you take Habermas, for instance, and put that and analyze the artifact from that perspective, I haven't done that in this case, because this particular artifact had some limitations, and we want to move away from that into this online platform for social integration, and there we use Habermas, for instance. But what are you missing? Just
questions.
Okay, yeah.
No, I just wanted to hear your rationale.
Yeah.
So can I go one more? Just because there's, we talked a bit or a lot of minutes about philosophy and philosophizing, but you also talk about theory and theorizing.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, because you theorize in different ways in the different cycles, depending on what you did, or actually the formalization of learning, I guess, and the reflection and learning aspects. So how would you describe the difference between theorizing and philosophizing?
That's a very good question.
As well, theory and philosophy.
Yes, that's a very good question. The main difference is that, by the way, when I talk about these words, I put it in the context of my research. I'm not trying to give an overall generalization about the distinction between theorizing and philosophizing. But the main difference in this context is that when you theorize, well, at least when I did, it was more a process of building upon certain concepts, such as the concept of presence in e-learning, and go from that to understand it from a more fundamental perspective. I needed to start using philosophical ideas about this. And then, from there on, when you deal with the philosophical language, it really becomes interesting, because you're not really, in my case, not theorizing in that sense. Because theorizing usually leads to something, a theory or something like that. But when you philosophize, you can, as Professor Science said, you can have a symposium as well, but you usually try to understand by critically examining the underlying things of, for instance, a theory, or what is knowledge, and so forth. And what I did here was to try to more understand it firmly from the roots. What is presence in general, and then what is presence in a virtual environment, what is presence in e-learning, and so forth. So that was my process of philosophizing, and I used Heidegger's philosophy language to do that. So the main distinction is that theory, perhaps you follow sometimes a model in order to theorize and come up with an outcome, but when you philosophize, you seldom use models, pragmatic ones, that lead to some kind of outcome or theory. That's my answer.
Okay, fair enough. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, I have 2 questions. One is very blunt, and then Mo asked me to ask one question about Habermas. The blunt question comes from reading the title. Yes. There's the 3 words, designing, and then it's 4, which was important, there's 4 words. And then there's an adjective called adaptable, and then there's a word learning. And the research methodologies maybe are where you design something and kind of intervene the work and improve it. So if I understand right, reading the title and this discussion, do you claim that learning in your context, now after your work, has become more adaptable?
It has become more adaptable?
Has it become more adaptable?
More adaptable?
Or has it become adaptable if it wasn't adaptable before?
Yes, in some sense it has. By the way, sorry, I'm just going to answer your question, but I missed a question was, what is adaptable learning? That is a fundamental question, which is partially related to your question, I would say. Because when I talk about adaptable, I talk about it as a mode. And a mode can be an outcome, but it can also be a prerequisite in some sense. So in this case, we created adaptable learning environments, for instance, for integration workers, as well as the newcomers. So in that sense, moving away from the original way of working with civic orientation, and then designing technologies that mediate some sense of adaptability, it led to that the learning became more adaptably organized and conducted, I would say.
And it's exactly learning and not training which has become more adaptable.
Yes.
And can that be evaluated, verified in light of facts that it has?
Yes, it can, especially from the perspective of work-integrated learning of the new integration workers. Because we did some evaluations, some survey evaluations, but those were mostly done because we wanted to have some facts about what has happened since we introduced the platform. How has that affected your work? In what sense are you more flexible now in terms of organizing and conducting your sessions in a blended learning environment? That led to some facts about it. Well, there is an ingredient of adaptability here that opens up for us to work in different environments, in different time.
Maybe I have a comment. I kind of missed that kind of evaluations to be read.
Yes.
Then this one thing is the second thing was design theories, that the motivation for the problem gives a hint that when we have this adaptability in the learning, then integration somehow improves.
The what?
Integration.
Integration improves.
Is that possible to evaluate that this happens?
We haven't done that, and there's a reason towards that. It's because my study is mainly focused on the work-integrated learning of the new integration workers. So they were my main target group. We didn't work so much with the newcomers. So we haven't, from that perspective, evaluated that.
Would that be an interesting research? Right?
Very interesting research. Yeah.
Then I go to the Habermas question. You say that you utilize Habermas's philosophy and theory of communicative action. And I was first saying yippee because it was something which I tried to do in my Ph.D. in design of one methodology and so on a long time ago. Habermas has, for instance, 3 knowledge interests and related to rationalities, and actually 4 rationalities would at least. There's a technical knowledge interest, how we do our work, and then we have the communicative interactions where we have the interpretive actions about from pragmatist viewpoint, and then we have this emancipatory thing. And for instance, Kalle Lyytinen has written a load about these kind of applications here. I kind of missed when you say that you use Habermas's theory of communicative action, that these kind of elements to see that how you reflect your work. Have you done it elsewhere? when you say that you have utilized Habermas's TCA, or do you see the way to go?
We are in the process of doing that actually. Me and Johanni and Leona in an upcoming paper, because we also felt that this particular piece was limited in terms of utilizing TCA for designing an open learning platform. That's why we have the title, How Habermasian Philosophy Can Inspire the Design of Open Learning Platform for Social Integration.
I think so. Now, if I have a mean comment on that,
okay,
I'm usually not mean.
That's okay.
So you have come into the conclusion that it might be a good idea to apply Habermasian principles. Is that the result?
No, but it depends what you mean by you applying, in what way. I mean, in this particular case, we claim that we have applied Habermas typology in order to conceptualize a meta design. So that's one way of applying it. But if you mean like applying it in a tangible artifact or a version of this online learning platform, we haven't come that far. But research is progressive, so
you are getting there.
Yeah.
So there might be a good idea to look at this kind of literature, which since Lyytinen has given some things to look at.
Are you referring to the ones from the 80s, by the way?
Yeah.
Yes, we have read those. But I haven't read your Ph.D. That's one thing that I must do, actually. Yes.
So my last question was that what is new in your application of Habermas in our field? What is the contribution of your application?
It is in the context of the research objective, that is, how to improve integration in society.
Okay. Actually, I believe my voice is loud enough. But I don't want to talk it. Okay, Amir, thank you. And makes sense that I'm the last one, since I'm a bit of an outsider to the design DSR community, which doesn't mean that I don't understand and appreciate your work, but what I'd like to do with my two questions is to go beyond a little bit of what you've done. So the purpose of your work was to design for integration work, and for all that the ADR design work and developing the prototype, etc., makes sense. But at the core of this phenomena, core of the problem is the phenomena of immigration and integration of new people to society. So I started wondering, I mean, this is an extremely important topic and a big question, big challenge that won't go away in near future. Your work is useful, but a lot of things remain to be done. So if we, and a lot of disciplines are focusing on this, no doubt about it, but sticking with IS, but forgetting about ADR and design science, I'm not saying you shouldn't have done that, but what else could be done? What kind of IS research could produce something as, how could you have gotten similar results without the prototype, maybe? Can you think of any other approach? No. And again, this is not criticism of what you've done, but
well, it opens up my perspectives in many ways. I don't have a good answer towards that, unfortunately, right now, because I need to figure out if there are things that I could have done differently, but still get the same results.
well, maybe not
the same result, but similar contributions.
Or as as significant contributions. How to approach the problem, maybe.
Okay. So one thing what we could have done, I think there's a MISQ paper from 2016 or 17 by I don't remember the name of the authors, but they investigate how ICT can be used for not newcomers. They use the term newcomers, in essence, newcomers, immigrants. How can ICT be distributed and used for them to learn about society? And during this process, when we digitalized the civic orientation program, we interacted with different actors of society who were designing artifacts that essentially had the aim of contributing to integration work. So one person, for instance, created an artifact learning the language. Another one was talking about learning norms and values in some sense. And I think all these people are contributing to this problem. And as our role as a researcher could be, as IS researcher, could be to elucidate this and write about this. So that is one thing that I could actually do in order to complement or add something to this kind of research.
Yeah. And particularly in the future research, there are plenty of opportunities for user studies, either with the immigrants or the tutors, etc. But that's for future research. Another is my other question, or something that I'd like you to talk about a bit, is related to the sort of generalizability of your results. Because what you've done, the prototype is very specifically for of course it's for one purpose, but in many places you justify, you say that the special uniqueness here comes from the heterogeneity of the user group. But then again, I mean, wouldn't this group of people, wouldn't we be heterogeneous? Then again, wouldn't the immigrants, you could say that it's very homogeneous, they are all immigrants. So it depends on how you measure it. So acknowledging the heterogeneity is a good thing. And if we acknowledge that it's not only something related to people looked from the perspective of society, I started thinking about what of your results, or even some ideas or part of the artifact, are applicable to other kind of contexts, even commercial or work, other business kind of in environments. So can you
that is a very good question, and that's one part of this adaptable theme, is that I remember when me and my colleagues worked on this artifact, we didn't want it to become another Moodle or another isolated, stiff artifact with who have the ability to only accomplish certain objectives per se, because the main objective here was learning. In this case, particularly, it's learning civic orientation. So we started thinking about how can we design, form, and establish an adaptability to the artifact, so the content can vary, and the form can also vary. So you can add on to the form, to the designs, design elements, interface elements. And this was a very difficult task to address, and I can be honest with you that I couldn't have done this by myself alone. So this was mostly a contribution of my colleagues, because they have this knowledge which they brought in and said that we need to put it simple, but at least it should cover all these aspects of incorporating civic orientation content, but it shall also have the ability to grow over time without getting too messy, because a lot of systems, you see, when they grow, it becomes difficult to see the essence of the system. What was it for from the beginning? What was the main purpose of designing the system? So yes, we designed a template, let us say, which could be used for different areas of learning as well. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So I have just one final question.
You want to-
I don't know. Okay, thanks. No, just one question when you talked about the title of the presentation, because the previous version that I saw had a subtitle that was Supporting Information Technologies for Integration Work.
Yes,
Why was that dropped?
because it's much nicer with short titles. No, it's because I think,
Because to me, it sort of explained a bit more what it was actually about.
yes, the particular case.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I basically dropped it because designing for adaptable learning for me is, designing for integration work is, as I addressed it, a special case of designing for adaptable learning. Whereas from a more abstract perspective, this whole idea of adaptable learning is not only about supporting integration work. Of course, we need to ground that empirically in order to write a thesis.
So you're implying generalizability.
I am doing that, but unfortunately I've not been able to do that to a degree where I feel totally satisfied. So this is an ongoing thing for me right now, to how to proceed with the generalizability of designing for adaptable learning. Yes.
You also missed the colon.
Huh?
The most important part of titles is colon.
Color.
No, it's a
colon.
and then colon. Somebody did a study that acceptable papers, 90% probability increases if you have a colon.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now it's time for you, the audience, to put any questions. Anybody of you want to start? Yes.
No, not him.
Okay, thank you for a very interesting discussion. I'm not very much of a philosopher, and I don't know much about integration work. But one thing that I thought about a lot during your discussion was the concept of identity, which intuitively seems very important in the context of integration work. And I know for a fact that Heidegger wrote about that a bit. And there was also a very interesting paper from Fernando Flores, I think in '98, about this topic, which discusses the changes in our ways of understanding identity given the new digital age. So my question is basically, have you thought about these things, these concepts in any way? In what way have they affected your work?
I haven't thought about those particular terms, I must say, in terms of identity, because I've been more focused on Dasein, and that identity is obviously a part of Dasein, but I haven't been explicitly focusing on the identity part yet. But it is an essential part, because what happens when you extend the newcomer's life world, for instance? How did that affect their view of themselves as persons, as citizens of a new society? And how does society view them as individuals? And how does that affect their identity and so forth? These are relevant things, but I haven't gone too far with them yet.
Any more questions? No? You have the chance. Yes. Thank you everybody involved very much for this. I now will close the seminar, and thank you everybody. And the audience, you're welcome to Entré OL. And the examination committee will now have a meeting and discuss the judgment of Amir's thesis, and they will come to Entré OL after that and inform you about the result. Thank you.